It had been 10 long, grinding years that Ethan Carter had carried the full weight of his household on his shoulders, tending day and night to his paralyzed father-in-law, William Hale. Every waking hour blurred into the same tedious, draining cycle: spoon-feeding, rolling stiff limbs, guiding slow, grueling physical therapy sessions. A decade of endless labor had chipped away at his youth, sanded down every sharp edge of his personality, and bound him to a man who shared no drop of his blood, bound only by quiet, unshakable devotion. All the while, his wife Sarah had kept him trapped in a cold, silent, emotional void. Sarah fixated relentlessly on climbing the corporate ladder, deliberately shirking every domestic duty, blind to the decade of quiet sacrifice unfolding right before her eyes. To her, their marriage had curdled into a suffocating cage, void of joy or warmth. Without a single second of hesitation, she brought up divorce and cruelly concealed William's vehement opposition to their split. Her flat, dismissive line, "Our dad doesn't have any objections, Darstige," shattered every fragile hope Ethan had clung to. Through 10 years of uncomplaining hardship, the pair signed their divorce papers calmly and stepped out of the county courthouse side by side, numb and unfeeling. Seconds later, a bank alert pinged on Sarah's phone, stripping away every layer of her self-serving pretense. William had rewritten all his savings accounts, naming Ethan the sole beneficiary of every cent upon his passing. The elderly man, robbed of speech, had voiced his boundless gratitude for Ethan's decade of selflessness through his entire life's fortune. Sarah crumpled instantly. She handed in her high-paying executive position, retreated fully into the home she'd abandoned for so long, and threw herself into learning how to bathe, feed, and comfort her father, slowly reaching out to mend the fractured bond between herself and Ethan. Though legally divorced, they continued sharing the same roof, learning to accommodate one another's festering wounds with gentle patience. Ethan dusted off the design career he'd abandoned 10 years prior, and William's physical condition steadily improved. Amid the quiet, mundane rhythm of daily meals, laundry, and quiet bedside chats, the frayed threads of family and lost love slowly stitched themselves back together. The whole story hummed with a heavy, suppressed grief built on a decade of misplaced loyalty and unspoken familial affection. A slow-burn narrative of hardship, followed by fragile, hard-won peace. Ethan often found himself trapped in a looping, aching question. After 10 years of cold neglect, after putting pen to paper on divorce papers of his own free will, could he ever fully erase the mountain of disappointment stacked heavy in his chest and accept Sarah's belated attempts to make amends? Sarah, too, carried an unanswerable weight. Having ignored both her husband and her father for a full decade, having single-handedly torn their marriage apart, would her sudden burst of remorse and round-the-clock presence ever be enough to repay the years of avoidance and hurt she'd inflicted? And their fragile new living arrangement, held together only by the elderly man's life savings and a fleeting rush of remorse. Once the initial rush of regret faded, would old resentment flare back to life? Was this quiet coexistence a lasting, genuine homecoming, or merely a temporary bandage to soothe their guilty consciences? My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 45 years old, an ordinary man through and through. Blend me into any crowd, and no one would spare me a second glance. I stand 5 feet 8 inches tall, weighing 140 pounds, solid, average build, nothing striking about my face, pleasant enough to look at, yet easily forgotten the moment you look away. 10 years ago, my hair had been thick and dark, but now a full third of my temples had turned silver, my hairline receding far enough to leave a vulnerable strip of pale forehead exposed. Deep wrinkles crinkled beneath my eyes, etched there permanently, even when my face rested neutral. When I smiled, those folds deepened enough to trap a fly. Time had carved itself harshly across my features over this past decade. Today was unlike any other, strange enough that I'd woken long before my alarm, lying rigid beneath the sheets for 30 minutes, staring blankly at the popcorn ceiling overhead. The space beside me on the mattress sat empty, the sheets folded crisp and wrinkle-free. Sarah had moved into the spare bedroom office more than half a year prior. The physical distance between us had stretched from half a yard to an entire wall, and the emotional chasm separating us might as well have spanned an entire galaxy. I rolled onto my side, glancing at the digital clock on the nightstand, 6:03 in the morning. Outside the window, the sky hung a dull, murky grey, and the distant scratch of a street sweeper's brush drifted up from the road below. 6 a.m. My internal clock never failed, not once in 10 years, rain or shine. I pushed myself out of bed as silently as I could, easing the bedroom door open. The living room remained shrouded in shadow, save for a faint glow spilling from the far end of the hallway. William's bedroom nightlight, left burning all night long, so he could signal for help if he needed anything and couldn't reach the call button beside his mattress. I padded down the hall and pushed open his door, greeted at once by a layered scent. Mild prescription medicine, antiseptic disinfectant, and the faint, unique odor that clung to anyone confined to bed long-term. 10 years ago, that smell had turned my stomach, but now it settled in my chest like quiet reassurance. It meant he was still breathing beside me. William Hale, my father-in-law, was 73 years old. Before the brain hemorrhage that upended all our lives 10 years prior, he'd stood nearly 6 feet tall, tipping the scales at 176 pounds, a robust, energetic man who walked with purpose and spoke in a loud, booming baritone. Now he lay curled within the hospital bed, his frame wasted away to skin and brittle bone, loose flesh hanging slack over sharpened bones. The fingers of his right hand stayed locked in a permanent, rigid curl, never to fully open again. I stepped to the edge of his bed just as his eyes fluttered open. Those eyes had once been sharp as a carpenter's handplane, able to spot a crooked wood grain or misaligned joint at a single glance. Now the whites had clouded yellow, his pupils dull and unfocused. But every time his gaze landed on me, a tiny spark of light flickered to life within them. "Dad, time to roll you over," I murmured, leaning forward to peel back the hospital blanket covering his thin shoulders. This had been my first task every single morning for 10 years. Bedridden patients developed painful bed sores if left in one position for more than 2 hours, their skin quickly reddening and blistering under constant pressure. I slid both hands beneath his hips and shoulders, supporting his weight gently, my voice soft as I counted. 1, 2, 3, shift. His body felt shockingly light in my grasp. I eased him onto his right side, then checked the disposable protective pad beneath his hips, relieved to find it dry and clean. I smoothed out the sheet and fresh pad, running my palm along his spine to check for any tender red marks forming on his skin, then wrapped my fingers around his left hand. The only limb he could move freely, thin as a twig beneath my palm, and slowly worked his stiff knuckles back and forth. "The sun's finally breaking through after 3 straight days of grey rain," I said, massaging each joint one by one. "Later, I'll wheel you out onto the balcony to soak up some vitamin D. Lisa mentioned your nails grew long yesterday. I'll trim them for you after breakfast." He watched me quietly, his lips twitching as he struggled to form words, only releasing muffled, breathless grunts. I leaned my ear closer, straining to pass his sounds, but caught nothing more than faint air. Frustration flickered across his face, and he squeezed my palm tight with his functional left hand. "Take your time," I patted the back of his bony hand gently. No rush at all. The tension melted from his features, and he nodded faintly. This silent exchange was our language now. Nods, shakes, glimmers in his eyes, varying pressure from his grip. After a decade together, I could decipher most of what he wanted to say. If he glanced toward the drawer of his nightstand, he was hungry, reaching for the packaged crackers stashed inside. If he dragged his tongue across dry lips, he craved water. If his brows drew tight and his gaze locked onto mine, he was in discomfort. For every thought he couldn't voice aloud, I guessed until he signaled yes or no, a slow, tedious process that sometimes took 5 minutes just to confirm he needed to use the restroom. But I had endless patience. Over 10 years, free time had never been something I lacked. Once I'd finished rolling him, wiped his face with a damp cloth, and changed his sleep shirt, I retreated to the kitchen. The electric stove simmered a pot of millet porridge, while the steamer warmed leftover chive and egg buns, William's favourite meal from the days before his stroke. I fried 2 runny poached eggs, one for Sarah and one for myself. The kitchen window faced east, and the sun peeked through a gap between the apartment buildings, spilling soft orange light across the stovetop and gilding the stainless steel pot lids. By 7:30, breakfast sat fully prepared. I first lifted William into a propped-up seated position against stacked pillows at the head of his bed, feeding him small spoonfuls of warm porridge. His swallowing reflex had weakened drastically. Eating too fast triggered painful choking fits, so I waited for every mouthful to slide down his throat before offering another. The small bowl of porridge took more than 20 minutes to finish, reheated twice as it cooled mid-meal. He couldn't manage the soft buns whole, so I scraped out the savoury filling, mashed it into the porridge, and spooned the mixture to him bit by bit. When he finished, tiny grains clung to the corners of his mouth. I wiped them away with a damp towel, and he rewarded me with a faint, fragile smile. Just a subtle upward tug of his lips, barely there. 10 years ago, his laughter had boomed loud enough to fill every room in the house, deep and unrestrained. Now all he could manage was this quiet, fleeting grin, delicate as a late autumn bloom clinging to its stem. I then called Sarah to come eat breakfast. She had the day off from work, yet her bedroom door remained shut tight, no sound stirring from within. I knocked twice and announced that the meal was ready, receiving only a vague, muffled hum in response before silence settled again. I sat alone at the dining table, watching my poached egg cool from steaming hot to lukewarm, then fully cold. I prodded the runny yolk with my chopstick, watching amber liquid seep across the white ceramic plate, spreading outward in a faint ring. My mind drifted back to the early days of our marriage, 10 years prior. Back then, we'd eaten breakfast side by side every single morning. Sarah rambled non-stop about office gossip, complaining about overbearing supervisors and botched client projects, while I told her about the design drafts I'd finished the day before, venting about absurd demands from difficult customers. We'd laugh and chat through every meal, drawing out breakfast for a full hour without noticing the time slip away. Those days felt like a distant memory now, half forgotten, shrouded in haze. I popped the cold egg into my mouth, chewed slowly, and swallowed before standing to wash the dishes. Running water rushed over my fingers as I stared down at my hands, knuckles swollen and rough, permanently stained with the faint, lingering scent of medicine that never fully washed away. The middle and index fingers on my right hand bore slight, permanent deformity from years of massaging William's stiff limbs every single day. These hands had once gripped digital drawing tablets, drafting intricate design layouts. Now they grasped disposable diapers and pill bottles instead. Still, I'd never once regretted my choice. It was a strange feeling, living day in and day out under such stifling pressure, yet holding an unshakable resolve deep in my chest. rooted in duty and genuine affection. William was far more than my father-in-law now. After 10 years of constant, intimate care, he'd become the father I'd never known I needed. When my spirits sank low, he'd pat the back of my hand with his left palm to comfort me. When I came down with a fever or cold, he'd hammer the emergency call button for 10 straight minutes, desperate to summon a neighbor to help me. When I trimmed his facial hair, he tilted his chin upward, cooperating without resistance. We shared no spoken words, but we shared 10 irreplaceable years together. At 9 a.m., Lisa Moore arrived for her shift. She was a bright, cheerful woman in her early 30s, round-faced, with a ponytail, quick and efficient at her care work. She came 5 days a week, 2 hours each afternoon, to lead William through guided physical therapy. Today, though, she'd showed up hours early, explaining she needed to swap shifts to handle a personal errand later that afternoon. "Is this all right with you, Ethan?" she asked, slipping off her sneakers at the entryway. "Of course, don't worry about it," I replied. "Perfect timing, actually. I've got an errand I need to run this afternoon too." Lisa nodded simply, asking no follow-up questions. She stepped into William's bedroom, and I heard her bright, warm voice drift through the closed door. "How are we feeling today, Grandpa? Let's work out that left hand of yours, okay?" Muffled grunts of response echoed back from the bed. I leaned against the living room wall, my mind foggy and distant. That afternoon, I planned to file for divorce, and I hadn't told a soul. My parents knew nothing of it, Lisa had no clue, and William remained unaware. Or perhaps he suspected, but I'd never spoken the truth aloud to him. Sarah had claimed he held no opposition to our split, yet I couldn't bring myself to press her for details. A decade of quiet observation had taught me a hard truth. Some truths hurt far less left unspoken. I walked into the spare office and pulled open a desk drawer, retrieving a thick manila envelope holding every document required for divorce. Copies of our IDs, the original marriage license, household registration paperwork, and a pre-negotiated asset division agreement. Sarah had handed the envelope to me the week prior, her expression flat and detached, as if passing over a routine work report. I'd taken it without a single tremor in my hands, signing the preliminary papers as casually as I would sign a client contract. We'd both been eerily calm through the entire process, so quiet it felt as though our 10-year marriage had been nothing more than a vivid, fleeting hallucination. No screaming fights, no tearful breakdowns, no slamming furniture or shattered plates. One ordinary weeknight, she'd wandered into the office and said, "Ethan, I think we should get divorced." I'd paused for a long beat, then replied, "All right." We'd begun gathering paperwork the next day, our conversation as mundane as debating what to cook for dinner that night. Only I knew the truth of that evening. I'd sat out on the apartment balcony afterward, smoking half a pack of cigarettes, one after another, my throat raw and my lips numb from tobacco fumes. I watched the windows of every neighboring apartment flicker dark, one by one, the entire city sinking into quiet night, replaying the same looping question over and over in my head. Where had we gone wrong over these 10 years? I turned the memory over 100 different ways, yet never found a satisfying answer. Once the cigarettes ran out and dawn neared, I dragged myself back to bed, slept a single hour, and woke promptly at 6 to roll William over, just as I did every morning. Life did not pause to grieve a broken heart. William still lay confined to his bed, meals still needed cooking, diapers still required changing, and the daily grind pressed forward without mercy. While sorting through storage boxes in the office, I stumbled across an old photo album, purchased the year we'd married. Its brown leather cover bore gilded lettering reading, "Our lifetime of happiness, Astas." The album was thick, yet only the first few pages held photographs, Every page afterward sat empty, blank, and untouched. Much like our marriage, vivid and bright at its opening, then hollow and devoid of memory as the years dragged on. The first page held our wedding portraits. Sarah stood beneath golden autumn ginkgo trees in a public park, dressed in a white lace wedding gown, her eyes crinkled into bright crescent moons as she laughed. I stood beside her in a rented black suit, my necktie askew, hair stiff with cheap styling gel, awkward and stiff as a nervous penguin. We'd both been so young back then. She 24, I 25, our eyes brimming with light, hope, and endless, unbridled optimism for the future. We truly believed marriage would keep that sweet, glowing joy alive forever. The second page featured snapshots from our wedding reception. William sat front and center at the main table, wearing a dark grey tailored suit with a red flower pinned to his chest. His hair had still been fully dark, his facial wrinkles far less pronounced, grinning and nodding at every guest who wandered over to toast us. When our turn came to circulate the room, he stood abruptly and clapped a heavy, calloused palm against my shoulder. His hands hardened by decades of carpentry work, solid and weighty against my frame. "Son," he'd leaned in close, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah lost her mother young, and I spoiled her something terrible. She's stubborn, hot-headed. Promise me you'll always cut her slack." I'd nodded firmly. "I won't let you down, Dad." He clapped my shoulder once more, falling silent, yet as I watched him later that night, once all guests had departed, he stood alone outside the hotel entrance, staring up at the full moon without moving for ages. I'd stepped forward to comfort him, but Sarah pulled me back, whispering, "Let him be alone for a while. He stood out here all night the day Mum passed, staring at the moon, just like this." That night, I'd first grasped the immense weight carried by the word father. He'd raised a motherless daughter single-handedly, filling both parental roles, and now he was handing her life over to another man. Every tangled, conflicting emotion he carried had condensed into that single plea. Be patient with her, Sass. The third page captured photos from our honeymoon by the ocean. Sarah ran barefoot along the sand in a flowery sundress, the fabric billowing in the coastal wind, twisting back to grin at the camera. The shot froze her mid-laugh, free and light as a bird, endless blue ocean stretching out behind her beneath a wide-open sky. I stared at that photograph for a long stretch of time, then flipped the page to blank white paper. Then the next page, also empty. Dozens upon dozens of thick album pages sat unused, devoid of any memories to document, mirroring the empty silence that had settled over our lives in the years that followed. I closed the album and returned it to the cardboard storage box, digging deeper to uncover a small metal tin filled with tiny trinkets from our dating years. 2 faded movie ticket stubs for Startanic Dastanat, dated back to 2002, a theme park admission slip printed with a cartoon roller coaster graphic, a dark grey wool scarf Sarah had knitted for me, lopsided and full of uneven stitches, yet she'd told me proudly it was the first knitting project she'd ever finished, her fingers pricked raw countless times by metal needles over 2 months of work. Beneath those trinkets rested a stack of handwritten sticky notes, the love letters I'd slipped onto her desk every day during our courtship, filled with trivial, silly lines. "The cafeteria braised pork was amazing today. I saved you a portion. Saw an orange stray cat on my walk home. It's round, just like you." I unfolded each note one by one, a faint, sad smile tugging at my lips. 20-something me must have been ridiculous, thinking comparing her to a chubby stray cat qualified as romance. Back then, though, Sarah cherished every scrap of paper, taping every note to the partition wall of her office cubicle until the entire surface was covered top to bottom. When co-workers asked who wrote them, she'd smile like a child sneaking stolen candy, glowing with delight. When had that warmth faded? Text messages replaced handwritten notes, quick digital blips, far easier to send, yet the words grew shorter and colder by the month. Working overtime tonight. Won't be home for dinner. Okay. Eventually, even those half-hearted replies dried up entirely. Our phone galleries filled with work presentations and group chat screenshots. No single photograph of one another left stored anywhere. I sealed the metal tin and tucked it deep back into the storage box, drawing a deep, shaky breath before stepping back into the living room. Lisa knelt beside William's bed, working his left hand through guided stretches as she chatted casually with him. "Did you see that news story yesterday? A 90-year-old woman went skydiving. Can you believe how brave she was?" William couldn't respond verbally, yet his eyes lit up with interest, tapping one finger lightly against the bed frame every few seconds to signal he found the story fascinating. I leaned against the doorframe, watching their easy exchange, my throat tightening with suppressed sorrow. This quiet, gentle companionship had filled every day of the past decade. Someone to talk to William, someone to hold his hand and move his stiff joints, someone who saw him as a living, thinking human being, rather than a motionless body trapped in a hospital bed. For 10 years, Lisa, previous caregivers, and I had all treated him with that kindness. But Sarah? How long had it been since she'd sat down and spoken to her father properly? Every time she visited, she rushed in for a few fleeting minutes, then hurried out, her only lines hollow, empty pleasantries. "I'm heading out, Dad. I'll come back tomorrow to see you." She'd long forgotten the little girl who'd watched this man spend 30 minutes picking out perfect soft tofu at the farmer's market, just to cook her favorite spicy tofu dish. "Ethan, you've been standing there quiet a minute." Lisa glanced up and smiled. "Could you pass me that towel?" I snapped out of my daze, retrieving the cloth and handing it over. Her gaze lingered on my face, as if she sensed something weighing heavy on my heart. Yet she asked no questions. Sharp, tactful Lisa knew exactly when to speak and when to hold her tongue. "I'm heading out this afternoon," I told her. "Take good care of Dad while I'm gone." "Absolutely. Don't worry a single bit," she nodded reassuringly. As I turned to leave the room, William let out a muffled, urgent grunt. I spun back to face him, watching him lift his left hand slowly, pointing first toward the nightstand, then to his own chest, then straight at me. A silent gesture I knew all too well. "My heart belongs to you." He'd made the same hand signal that morning, and now repeated it once more. I crossed to the bed and wrapped my palm around his thin fingers. "I know, Dad. You're in my heart too." His gaze dimmed, lips trembling, as he struggled to form words he could never voice aloud. I knelt beside the mattress, leaning close enough to spot a single tear rolling slowly down his wrinkled cheek. "Don't cry." I wiped the moisture away with my sleeve, my voice cracking faintly. "No matter what happens today, I'll never leave you alone." He closed his eyes and shook his head gently. I couldn't decipher what that quiet motion meant then, but I would understand its weight much later. He wasn't weeping because I planned to leave, but because he felt helpless, powerless to stop what was unfolding between his daughter and me. At 1:50 p.m., Sarah arrived home precisely on schedule. She wore a crisp cream business suit, her hair pulled tight into a polished bun, makeup flawlessly applied, lips coated in muted rose lipstick. She looked far more prepared for a high-stakes corporate conference than a divorce hearing. "You ready?" She paused at the entryway to slip off her heels, refusing to meet my eyes. "Yep." I stepped out of the office, clutching the manila document envelope. "Let's go then." She grabbed her car keys and pushed open the front door without another word. I glanced back toward William's bedroom as I crossed the threshold, the door hanging ajar. Through the narrow gap, I spotted Lisa continuing his therapy stretches beside the bed, William's head tilted toward the doorway, his clouded eyes fixed firmly on my retreating figure. I gave a tiny, wordless nod in his direction, then followed Sarah outside into the stairwell. The hallway fell deathly silent, only the sharp click of her high heels echoing off concrete walls as she walked several paces ahead of me. I trailed behind, studying her silhouette, still slim, posture rigid and upright, barely showing signs of aging at 42. Time had treated her kindly over 10 years, only faint fine lines creasing the corners of her eyes to mark the passing seasons. In contrast, I'd aged decades in that same span, shifting from a vibrant 30-something man to prematurely worn middle age. The elevator carried only the two of us, its metal doors reflecting our distorted silhouettes, her polished, put-together outline next to my haggard, careworn frame. I stared at the blurred reflections for a heartbeat, then shifted my gaze to the elevator floor, unable to bear the contrast any longer. Once we climbed into her sedan, Sarah turned the ignition, reversing smoothly onto the main road. Bright afternoon sunlight blazed through the windshield, prompting her to slide on dark-tinted sunglasses that masked nearly all emotion on her face. Soft, ambient instrumental music played through the speakers, a gentle old Bandari track titled Spring Wilderness Asks Mask. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the world slide past the window. Leafy sycamore trees lining the sidewalk, delivery riders darting along two wheels, elderly strangers waiting at bus stops, young couples walking hand in hand across crosswalks. The city itself hadn't changed a single bit in 10 years. Only Sarah and I had fractured beyond recognition. "Does your dad know we're doing this?" I broke the long silence first. Her grip tightened slightly around the steering wheel, a beat of quiet hesitation before she replied, "I told him." "How did he react?" "He didn't react at all," she said flatly. "He can't speak, you know that." "He can nod or shake his head, though." Sarah refused to engage with my point, letting silence swallow the car once more, the soft piano melody the only sound filling the empty space between us. I stared out the passenger window, a heavy, suffocating weight settling in my chest. The man I'd cared for 10 straight years hadn't mustered a single reaction upon learning his daughter planned to separate from her husband. Those 4 words stung worse than outright rejection, as if my decade of devotion counted for nothing in his eyes, unworthy of even a small display of emotion. I had no way of knowing then how the conversation between Sarah and William had truly unfolded earlier that day. Lisa would recount every detail to me later. Lisa had been present for the exchange, watching Sarah sit beside the bed and deliver the news in a calm, unwavering tone. "Dad, Ethan and I can't keep going together. We're filing for divorce. Don't worry, I'll hire round-the-clock caregivers or move you to a top-tier nursing home. You won't be left without support." William's face remained blank and expressionless for a long stretch, so long that Sarah assumed he hadn't understood and repeated her statement again. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his functional left hand to form a silent sign. He pointed to his own ear, then to Sarah, then shook his head firmly. The gesture translated clearly. "I heard every word, and I do not agree." Sarah froze, stunned. "You don't want us to split up?" He shook his head again, this time with sharper, more urgent movement, desperation flooding his features. His lips trembled, rapid, breathless grunts spilling from his throat, his eyes instantly glistening with unshed tears. Sarah dropped her gaze, her voice wavering with quiet distress. But we've grown so far apart, Dad. Ethan spent all these years caring for you, not building a life with me. I want to live a normal life for once. William's hand fell limp to the bed. He stared at his daughter, a whirlwind of tangled emotions swirling behind his cloudy eyes. Disappointment, heartache, helplessness, and finally, a quiet, weary acceptance. He lowered his hand fully and closed his eyes, refusing to signal any further response. Sarah's claim that he'd held no objections was technically true. He'd stopped fighting after that moment. But that forceful shake of his head had spoken volumes of his heartbreak, a truth Sarah had deliberately ignored, too afraid to confront the profound disappointment she'd brought to her father's face. I remained completely oblivious to all of this as we drove to the county courthouse, convinced William truly didn't care, that 10 years of companionship meant nothing to him. The sharp sting of feeling rejected burrowed deep into my chest, impossible to pull free, too tender to touch. The courthouse sat in the southern district of the city, a 25-minute drive from our apartment. When Sarah parked the car, her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the key into the parking meter, fumbling twice before the slot accepted the metal key. I noticed her shaky movements, yet chose not to mention it. We stepped into the divorce services lobby, a sparse space with only 7 or 8 scattered visitors seated on plastic benches. A young couple huddled in the corner, the woman sobbing while her partner stared blankly at his phone, cold and detached. Further down the row, a middle-aged pair sat opposite one another, their gazes locked firmly on the floor, complete strangers sharing a single bench. This place must have been the saddest location in the entire city, a space where countless "we" walked through the front doors, only to exit as separate "you" and "me." A young clerk wearing thin-rimmed glasses reviewed our paperwork, reciting the standard mandatory questions in a monotone voice. "Are you both certain you wish to dissolve this marriage? Have all asset division terms been fully agreed upon?" "I'm certain," Sarah answered without hesitation, her voice steady and unshaken. I nodded once. "Yes." "No children from this union?" "None." "Please sign your names on the documents provided." Sarah picked up the pen first, the scratch of ink across paper echoing through the quiet room. When the pen reached my fingers, the metal tube felt unnaturally heavy, the public ballpoint worn smooth from hundreds of previous hands, a thin crack running down its plastic barrel. I stared at that tiny fracture for several long heartbeats before lowering my head to scrawl my full name. Ethan Carter, neat, evenly spaced letters. The clerk collected our signed papers, stamped the official seal twice, then slid 2 thin red divorce certificates across the counter toward us. "Congratulations, your legal marital bond is now terminated." The word congratulations landed with bitter irony. I lifted my certificate, gilded lettering glinting harshly under the overhead fluorescent lights. I flipped open the cover automatically, staring at our small passport-style photographs printed inside, beneath the typed line. "Marriage dissolved, following official review." My photo had been taken 5 years prior, my hair thicker, my smile genuine and bright. Sarah's portrait dated back 3 years earlier, her hair cut short, her expression sharp and professional. 2 outdated snapshots, bound together to mark the end of a decade-long partnership, life's cruelest form of irony. We stood and walked out of the lobby, one after another. Blinding midday sunlight crashed down over the concrete steps, forcing me to squint against the glare. Sarah marched ahead of me, her heels striking the pavement faster than they had on the drive over, as if desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the courthouse. I trailed 3 or 4 steps behind, clutching the divorce certificate tight in my palm, the thin paper burning hot against my skin like a branding iron. Abruptly, she froze mid-step, rigid as a statue, her shoulders trembling faintly. Her phone chimed with a flood of text alerts, the sharp ping echoing loud across the quiet sidewalk. She tilted her chin down to stare at the screen, and her entire body began to shake. First her fingertips, then her forearms, until her shoulders shuddered violently. Her leather handbag slipped off her shoulder, crashing against the concrete steps, lipstick and metal keys spilling out across the pavement, clattering several feet away. Yet she made no move to retrieve anything, standing stock still, the glow of her phone screen bleaching her face, a deathly pale white. "What's wrong?" I stepped forward to stand beside her. She didn't answer, slowly rotating to face me. Her entire facial features had twisted beyond recognition. Lips drained of all color, eyes bloodshot, a cocktail of shock, confusion, terror, and overwhelming, cataclysmic despair etched across every line of her skin. A despair I'd never once witnessed on her face in all our years together. "It's Dad," she forced the words out through a tight, constricted throat, barely audible. "He transferred all his savings to you." I froze, solid, confused. What? She lifted her phone to hold the screen toward me, the text message clear and unmissable beneath the sunlight, every word searing into my vision. I read it once without comprehension, then scanned the line a second time, and my mind exploded into a deafening buzz of shock. All fixed deposit accounts registered under William Hale, totaling approximately $40,000 USD, have been updated to name Ethan Carter as sole beneficiary upon account holders' passing. Every single dollar he'd saved over a lifetime belonged to me now. A gust of wind swept down the sidewalk, swirling discarded paper scraps, and a single withered dry leaf past our feet. Sarah's phone slipped from her grasp, slamming hard against the concrete steps with a sharp crack. She made no attempt to pick it up, standing motionless, her gaze hollow and empty. I bent to retrieve the device, a thin spiderweb of cracks spreading across the glass screen, yet the text alert remained illuminated, etched permanently into the broken display like a burning brand. I handed the phone back to her automatically. Her fingers brushed mine as she took it, ice cold, as if pulled straight from a refrigerator freezer. "This can't be right," she mumbled under her breath, her voice so faint a light breeze could carry it away. "I told him yesterday we were splitting up, and he nodded along. How could he do this?" I watched her broken, devastated expression, a tangled whirlwind of emotions churning through my chest. What could I possibly say to comfort her? Should I point out that her father had always valued me above all else? Should I state aloud that his 10 years of watching my labor had earned me this quiet recognition? Should I confront her for lying about his lack of opposition to our divorce? Every sentence circled through my mind repeatedly, yet none slipped past my lips. I simply stood beside her on the sun-scorched courthouse steps. Two people trapped in fate's cruel, unexpected twist, lost in the midday glare. Sarah sank slowly to the concrete ground, lowering one knee then the other until she curled inward, wrapping her arms around her shoulders and burying her face against her knees. She began to weep, quiet sniffles swelling into ragged, unrestrained sobs that echoed down the empty sidewalk. Passers-by slowed their pace to glance at the scene, curious, yet none stopped to offer comfort. In this crowded city, everyone carried their own heartbreak, no spare sympathy left for a stranger's suffering. I hovered beside her, helpless and unsure how to reach out. I wanted to lift her to her feet, yet pulled my hand halfway back before touching her. Legally, we were no longer married. The divorce certificate crumpled in my pocket burned against my thigh, proof our bond had dissolved. Emotionally, though, after more than a decade of shared history, bound together by the bedridden man who'd gifted me his entire life savings. The lines had blurred beyond repair. "Ethan." She lifted her tear-streaked face to meet my gaze. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks in thick black rivulets. "Do you hate me?" I remained silent for a long stretch of time. Hate had crossed my mind countless nights over the past decade. Evenings she returned home at midnight, days she stopped speaking to me entirely, the morning she moved into the spare bedroom, the afternoon she flatly proposed divorce without a single trace of remorse. Waves of resentment crashed over me repeatedly, rising and fading in endless cycles. Yet every time I stepped into William's bedroom and caught his faint reflection staring back at me from his clouded eyes, that bitter hatred dissolved beneath something far stronger. Something called responsibility and quiet, enduring love. "I don't hate you," I answered honestly at last, "but I'm deeply disappointed." Her sobs intensified, shoulders heaving like a remorseful young child caught misbehaving. I knelt beside her, pulling a pack of paper tissues from my jacket pocket and holding them out. She grabbed a handful, rubbing roughly at her smeared makeup, only smudging black and beige cosmetics further across the white tissue paper. "Do you know why Dad left all that money to you?" she gasped between broken breaths. "I don't," I replied. "Because he saw every single thing you did over these 10 years, far clearer than I ever did." She stared up at me with red, swollen eyes. "I'm his daughter, yet I never truly understood my own father, not half as well as a son-in-law unrelated to him by blood." I wanted to tell her I was never an outsider, yet the thought remained trapped, unspoken, in my mind. We knelt side by side on the courthouse steps for hours as the afternoon slipped into evening, Sarah crying until her tears dried up, then falling into a numb, empty silence, staring blankly at the endless stream of cars passing along the main road. I sat a small gap away from her, no hand-holding, no embrace, barely meeting each other's eyes, but neither of us stood to leave first. Eventually, the sky dimmed to deep indigo, streetlights flickering on one after another to cast golden halos over the pavement. Sarah finally stirred, pushing herself unsteadily to her feet. "Let's head home. I need to talk to Dad." I nodded and rose as well, my legs stiff and numb from prolonged kneeling. We walked toward the parking lot together, her footsteps slower and unsteady now, her high heels stumbling slightly against the asphalt as she shuffled forward. The drive home unfolded in unbroken silence once more, yet this quiet carried a different weight than our earlier ride. The silence on the way to the courthouse had stood as an impenetrable wall separating us. Now it felt like an empty room, waiting to be filled with mended words and healed feelings. When we pulled into the apartment building parking garage, Sarah cut the engine without rushing to exit. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring out at the glowing street lamp for minutes on end before speaking. "Ethan, about the money." "It's a gift from Dad," I cut her off gently before she could finish. "I know," her voice soft and defeated. "I don't intend to ask you to give it back. I just want you to understand. This isn't merely cash. It's his way of telling you he recognizes every sacrifice you've made over 10 years. He watched every single difficult moment, and he never forgot." I turned my head to look at her. Street lamp light filtered through the windshield, splitting her face into shadow and warm gold. Her eyes remained puffy from crying, stray tears clinging to her eyelashes, yet her tone had settled into calm acceptance, a far cry from the broken woman sobbing on the courthouse steps an hour prior. "I failed as his daughter," she whispered quietly. "You're the child he truly sees as his own." We pushed open the front door to our apartment to find the main lights switched off. only a warm amber wall lamp glowing above the dining table. William's wheelchair sat positioned beside the living room window, his back turned toward the entryway, gaze fixed on the dark night sky outside. Lisa sat on a stool beside him, scrolling through short videos on her phone, jumping up instantly when we stepped inside. "Ethan, Sarah, you're home." Her gaze flickered rapidly between our two faces, sharp enough to detect the raw grief hanging thick in the air, yet she politely refrained from asking questions. "Grandpa's spirits were really good this afternoon. He finished a full meal and kept making heart gestures with his left hand non-stop." Sarah remained frozen in the entryway, shoes still unremoved, staring straight at William's hunched silhouette in the wheelchair. He must have heard our arrival because his left hand twitched against the armrest, and he slowly, laboriously twisted his neck to face the front door, his clouded eyes cutting through the dim living room to lock onto us both. Lisa tidied her belongings and excused herself, closing the front door softly behind her and leaving the three of us alone. Warm lamplight spilled soft, blurred shadows across the walls, the night outside thick and ink black, tiny scattered lights twinkling from distant apartment windows. Sarah crossed the room to circle around the wheelchair, then sank slowly to her knees directly in front of him, tilting her head upward to gaze at his gaunt, lined face. The amber lamp glow softened every deep crease etched into his skin, wrinkles mapped out like a crumpled, unfolded parchment detailing every hardship time had dealt him. His eyes lowered to meet his kneeling daughter's stare, layered with quiet understanding and a gentle, almost pitying tenderness I could never fully name. "Dad," Sarah's voice cracked with unshed tears. "I filed for divorce today." William blinked once, neither nodding nor shaking his head. He simply watched her, slowly lifting his left hand to brush lightly across the top of her hair. The movement mirrored the gentle way he'd ruffled her childhood hair after school, though his palm had once been broad, warm and sturdy, now only a frame of sharp, thin bones beneath loose skin. "I pulled Ethan away from you." Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, splattering dark spots onto the wool blanket draped over his knees. "I've wronged him, and I've wronged you too. I know you left all your savings to him now." His hand paused mid-stroke, falling away from her hair. He glanced between Sarah and myself, then stretched his left hand forward, pointing first to me, then to his own chest, before pressing both index fingers together slowly, deliberately. The silent signal carried an unmistakable meaning. "You and I belong together." Sarah buried her face against the blanket, covering his legs, her shoulders shaking violently with quiet sobs. William's bony hand returned to stroke her hair repeatedly, the same soothing motion he'd used to calm her crying as a small girl decades ago. I stood frozen in the entryway, my sinuses burning with suppressed emotion, spinning to face the kitchen window to hide my glistening eyes. I twisted the kitchen faucet on and splashed cold tap water over my face, washing away the flood of tangled grief swirling inside me. Through the glass window, I stared out at the black night sky, replaying 10 years of fragmented memories in rapid succession. His desperate tears immediately after the stroke, the quiet pride when he managed to grip a spoon unassisted for the first time. The way he clung tight to my wrist during midnight fevers, the faint, silent smile he offered me every single dawn. I had never once considered him a burden. He was my family. When I dried my face and stepped back into the living room, Sarah had risen from the floor. She rotated William's wheelchair toward the dining table and rummaged through the refrigerator, pulling out leftover cooked vegetables. "You haven't eaten dinner yet, have you?" she asked me, her tone still thick with nasal congestion from crying, yet far calmer. "I'll heat up a bowl of noodles for you." "There are leftover dishes from lunch in the fridge," I replied. warm those up instead," she said, already lighting the gas stove, pouring oil into a pan and tossing the leftover vegetables inside. Sizzling fried aromas filled the room, the clink of metal cookware echoing through the quiet apartment. William sat at the table, his gaze fixed on Sarah's busy silhouette in the kitchen. I pulled a chair beside him and adjusted the wool blanket draped over his knees, tucking loose fabric securely around his legs. He twisted his head to look at me, then stretched his left hand to wrap his thin fingers around mine. His palm felt cold and bony, knuckles protruding sharply beneath loose skin, yet his grip held firm, unyielding. "Dad," I whispered softly, "I'm right here with you." He stared at me, that faint spark of light reigniting bright within his cloudy eyes. I'd seen that glimmer countless times over 10 years, and every single instance confirmed one simple truth. All the hardship had been worthwhile. That evening, Sarah reheated our leftovers, and the three of us shared a belated dinner around our small wooden dining table. William couldn't digest heavy, salty stir-fry, so I mixed a thick, sweet lotus root starch porridge for him, feeding him tiny spoonfuls at a slow pace. He swallowed every mouthful obediently, occasionally tapping the edge of the ceramic bowl with his left finger to signal he wanted more. Sarah sat across from me, shoveling rice quietly before pausing her chopsticks mid-bite. "Ethan, there's one thing I deeply regret about yesterday." "What's that?" "When I told Dad we were divorcing, I never stopped to truly look at his face." She set her utensils down, her eyes glistening again. I rushed out the door immediately after speaking, too cowardly to meet his gaze. If I'd lingered even a second longer, I would have seen how strongly he disagreed with our choice. I offered no reply. Some wounds cut too deep to voice aloud, unspoken grief lingering heavier than any confessed sorrow. Still, her willingness to acknowledge her mistake marked a fragile step forward, more valuable than any empty apology. After dinner, Sarah volunteered to wash all the dishes. I wheeled William's chair out onto the balcony to breathe in the cool night air. A faint, sweet fragrance drifted upward from the osmanthus bushes planted downstairs, colourful neon lights flickering on distant high-rise buildings across the city skyline. William leaned back against the wheelchair's padded headrest, tilting his chin upward to gaze at the dark sky. I couldn't tell if he watched scattered stars or wispy clouds, yet his expression rested peaceful, a faint, subtle smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I dragged a plastic patio chair beside him, and we sat in wordless companionship. The splash of running water from the kitchen sink mixed with Sarah's off-key humming, a wobbly rendition of Teresa Teng's The Sweetness Past. "Dad," I spoke into the quiet night, "what made you decide to transfer all your savings to me?" William twisted his head to study my face, his gaze heavy and thoughtful for a long moment, then formed a slow, deliberate gesture with his left hand. He pointed toward my chest, patted his own heart, then held up one finger and shook it gently side to side. A surge of warmth flooded my chest. His silent message translated clearly: "You hold the most important place in my heart. No explanation needed." This lifelong carpenter had never once spoken flowery, poetic words, yet with a single functional hand, he'd conveyed the most tender, heartfelt sentiment imaginable. I wrapped my palm around his bony fingers, resting on the wheelchair armrest, watching the cold skin slowly warm beneath my grip. Time seemed to freeze entirely in that moment. The soft balcony breeze, distant neon glow, running kitchen water, William's steady breathing, all blending seamlessly into an unchanging, perfect memory. Once Sarah finished washing dishes, she carried 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea outside, pulling a second patio chair to sit on William's opposite side. The three of us huddled together on the cramped balcony, the September night sky dotted with faint stars overhead, thousands of warm residential lights twinkling far below our feet. No one spoke, yet the silence no longer felt suffocating or hollow. It wrapped around us like soft, thick fabric, binding our fractured little family back together. A distant memory resurfaced unbidden in my mind. It had been only 2 months after William's stroke, when I'd brought him home from the hospital, overwhelmed and clueless how to care for a bedridden patient. He lay tangled in medical tubing, his eyes wide with raw terror and helplessness, trembling every time I stepped near his bed, his frame shaking like a dead leaf caught in a storm. I understood his fear fully. He'd spent his entire life as a strong, self-reliant man, terrified his son-in-law would secretly resent him, neglect his care, complain about the burden behind closed doors. The thought of relying on another person's mercy mortified him more than anything else. One rainy afternoon, I wiped his body clean and brushed against a dark bruise covering his calf, left over from hospital IV injections. I rubbed the tender spot gently and asked if it ached, yet he gave no visible response. As I finished covering him with blankets and turned to leave the room, he suddenly latched his left hand tight onto the cuff of my shirt. I spun back to kneel beside his bed, meeting his watery, trembling eyes as he struggled to form a silent hand signal, slow and labored. He pointed to his own chest, then to mine, before clasping both hands together and shaking them gently up and down. "Dad," I knelt lower to meet his eye level. "Are you trying to thank me?" He blinked rapidly, fresh tears rolling down his cheeks to soak into the pillow beneath his head. "Don't cry," I wiped his tears away with the sleeve of my flannel shirt. "You're my father-in-law. Taking care of you is simply what I should do." He continued weeping silently, endless tears streaming down his lined cheeks, the only sound in the room his faint, ragged gasps beneath the heavy rain hammering against the window panes outside. I didn't attempt to soothe him further, only knelt beside the bed holding his hand until his emotions settled. That rainy night marked a turning point between us. From that day forward, he stopped shrinking away from me in shame or guilt. He opened his mouth willingly when I brought food, twisted his body to cooperate during baths, tilted his chin upward without resistance when I trimmed his facial hair. A wordless trust bloomed between us, forged over endless shared hours, stronger than blood ties could ever be. I learnt much later what that initial hand signal had truly meant. You and I are family. That quiet gesture became our private, unspoken code after that day. He formed it when happy, when sad, even late at night if I passed his bedroom and spotted him awake through the cracked door. I always mirrored the signal back to him, murmuring the same quiet line every time. "Dad, I'm right here." 10 years had passed, yet that silent hand sign never altered. The balcony wind swept over us again, and I glanced back at William, his eyelids growing heavy and drooping, his left hand resting lightly atop Sarah's palm on the wheelchair armrest. Sarah's head nodded sleepily against her shoulders, her herbal tea gone cold in its ceramic mug. I stood to wheel William back inside, adjusting his position in bed, swapping out the damp protective pad beneath his hips, and dimming the nightlight beside his mattress. Once I finished tidying his bedroom, I returned to the balcony to put away our chairs, finding Sarah still seated alone, staring blankly out over the city lights. "Aren't you coming inside?" I asked. She shook her head. "I'd like to sit out here a little longer." I pulled a second chair beside her, settling down as soft September wind brushed across our faces, sweet as Mantha's scent drifting upward in gentle waves from the garden below. "Ethan," She broke the quiet after a long pause. I'm meeting Mr. Reed tomorrow morning to hand in my resignation from the executive team. I turned to glance at her. Streetlight glow filtered upward from the ground floor, blurring her facial features into soft shadow and pale gold. She didn't look toward me, her gaze fixed on the distant night sky, a faint, genuine smile tugging at her lips. You're willing to walk away from that high-ranking position? I am, she replied firmly. I misprioritized everything for 10 years straight. Career over love, work over family. Money can always be earned later, but the people you love vanish forever if you neglect them. She never uttered the words, "Let's remarry," and I avoided mentioning the divorce certificate tucked in my nightstand drawer. Still, we both understood something unspoken hung in the air between us. Legal paperwork didn't define the bond we shared, just as William's life savings had validated a decade of unspoken devotion without a single written sentence. Our fractured relationship required slow, patient rebuilding through consistent, daily actions, not official documents or rushed vows. We should head indoors. I pushed myself to my feet. The night air's growing chilly. She stood alongside me, and we walked back into the apartment, sliding the glass balcony door shut gently behind us. The main living room lights remained switched off, only a thin strip of warm yellow light leaking out from the crack beneath William's bedroom door. We stood motionless in the pitch-black entryway for several heartbeats, neither speaking a word. Then Sarah stretched her hand forward, fumbling through the dark to find mine, squeezing my palm lightly once before releasing it again. "Good night," she whispered softly. "Good night." She turned to walk toward the spare bedroom office, and I headed for the master bedroom. We still slept in separate rooms, yet this distance no longer stemmed from cold resentment or emotional division. We both needed time to untangle 10 years of misplaced priorities and hurt feelings, slowly straightening the winding wrong turns we'd taken together. The next morning, I woke promptly at 6 a.m. as usual to roll William over. When I pushed open his bedroom door, I froze in surprise. Sarah stood beside the hospital bed, dressed in soft loungewear, her hair loosely tied back in a messy ponytail, bent over adjusting his protective pad. Her movements remained clumsy and unrefined, yet far more competent than they'd been weeks prior. She'd already mastered supporting his hips and shoulders to shift his weight safely. "What are you doing up this early?" I paused in the doorway. "You wake up at this hour every single day." She glanced over her shoulder with a faint smile. "I wanted to learn how to handle his care routine, just in case you're stuck working overtime late some evening." I stepped into the room and took over the task from her hands. She stepped back to observe closely as I demonstrated proper technique, explaining every small detail as I rolled his body sideways. "Keep your palms flat beneath his waist to lift him. Don't dig your fingertips into his skin, it'll bruise him. You only need to shift him 45 degrees to avoid bed sores, and smooth out every wrinkle in the protective pad. Any folded fabric will rub raw red marks into his skin overnight." She nodded intently, absorbing every instruction like a dedicated student taking notes. William watched us both from the bed, a slow smile spreading across his wrinkled face as he formed a lopsided heart shape with his left hand. "Dad, don't tease me," Sarah laughed softly, wrapping her fingers around his thin palm. "I'm still learning slowly. Please be patient with me." Over breakfast, Sarah brought up her planned meeting with Mr. Reed. I paused mid-bite with my chopsticks hovering over my rice bowl. "I see. We're only grabbing lunch to talk everything through. It won't take long." "All right. Aren't you curious how I plan to explain my resignation?" I set my chopsticks down and met her eyes. "You'll tell me if you want to, and you don't have to if you don't. This choice belongs entirely to you." Sarah stared at me for several long seconds, then smiled faintly. "You've changed so much, Ethan." "In what way?" "Years ago, you'd ask 100 follow-up questions, wanting to track every hour of my schedule. Now you understand how to give someone space." I paused to reflect on her observation. Caring for Dad 10 years straight must have worn away my impatience. Nothing moves quickly with him. Every task demands slow, careful waiting. She fell silent, yet a soft, lingering smile remained fixed on her lips through the rest of our meal. Sarah left midday, wearing her cream business suit once more, yet abandoning the tight polished bun to let her dark hair fall loose over her shoulders. She hesitated briefly at the entryway before turning back to William's wheelchair, kneeling beside him to murmur, "Dad, I'm heading out for a little while. I'll be home soon." William met her gaze and nodded, lifting his left hand to pat her shoulder gently, a quiet blessing, granting her permission to leave. Once Sarah drove away, Lisa arrived for her afternoon shift. She radiated bright energy that day, rushing into the bedroom to pull a thick printed picture album from her tote bag, filled with colorful photographs of blooming flowers, wild birds, and rolling mountain landscapes. "I figured Grandpa gets bored stuck in bed all day. Pretty scenery might lift his mood," she explained, flipping through pages to show William each image. I sat in the living room, listening to Lisa's cheerful chatter and William's occasional muffled grunts of response, flipping through a vintage interior design magazine. 10 years had passed since I'd last touched professional design work, yet my innate eye for balance and color still lingered beneath years of neglect, stirring quiet excitement whenever I spotted a compelling layout or color palette. My phone vibrated against the coffee table, a message from Mr. Troy Bennett popping up on screen. "Ethan, the brand concept draft you submitted wowed the client. They're requesting an in-person meeting to finalize long-term collaboration. When does your schedule allow?" I stared at the text for a long moment, a warm rush of quiet pride swelling inside my chest. After 10 years of setting my career aside, someone valued my creative talent once more. I typed a quick reply. "I'm available tomorrow afternoon." "Perfect. I'll lock in a time slot for you," the response read seconds later. I set my phone down and exhaled a deep, relieved breath. Bright midday sunlight streamed through the living room window, casting amber reflections across my cold mug of tea. Sarah returned home shortly after 3 p.m., her footsteps light and bouncy, humming that same off-key rendition of Dawes' Sweetness under her breath. She tossed her leather handbag onto the sofa, kicked off her heels, and padded barefoot straight to William's bedroom, wrapping her arms around the back of his wheelchair from behind. "I'm home, Dad." She rested her chin lightly atop his grey hair, her voice warm and unburdened. William craned his neck upward to meet her gaze, his eyes crinkling into a happy smile. Sarah circled around to kneel in front of him, lacing her fingers through his left hand. "I spoke clearly with Mr. Reed today. I told him I can't prioritize my career over my family anymore, thanked him for all the opportunities he gave me, and explained we'll only communicate strictly about professional business matters from now on, no personal contact outside of work." Her tone remained calm and unemotional as she spoke, no trace of sadness or longing clinging to her words, as if that former executive position had been merely a wrong turn on a long road, one she'd simply corrected and left behind. "What did Mr. Reed say?" I asked from the living room doorway. "He was incredibly respectful, said he fully respected my decision." She stood upright, brushing stray strands of hair back from her face. "He even commented how lucky you are to have such a devoted father." A faint smile tugged at my lips, yet I offered no verbal response. William immediately began forming heart gestures again, the elderly man, newly obsessed with the silent signal, repeating it constantly with his left hand, lopsided yet instantly recognizable. "Dad, enough heart signs for today," Sarah laughed gently. "I'm in a fantastic mood. I'll make chive and egg dumplings for dinner tonight, your favorite." William's eyes lit up instantly, that same youthful warmth shining behind his cloudy pupils I'd seen decades prior. The man who'd spent half an hour selecting tofu for his daughter's childhood favorite dish, who'd handcrafted a tiny wooden wardrobe for her teenage bedroom, who'd once hoped to find a kind, steady partner for his grown girl. That light had dimmed beneath illness and heartbreak over the years, yet it blazed bright once more that afternoon. I watched the father and daughter interact, a soft, gentle rain falling over the parched, empty space inside my chest. Every small detail in our lives tilted slowly back toward healing, progress gradual yet steady, every step solid and unshakable. That evening, Sarah followed through on her promise to make dumplings, filling them with the same chive and egg filling William loved most. Her dough-rolling skills remained clumsy, the wrappers uneven in thickness and size, several dumplings splitting open mid-boil to spill their savory filling into the water. Still, William ate 7 full dumplings, 3 more than his usual portion, chewing slowly and contentedly, lifting his left hand to give Sarah a shaky thumbs up once he finished. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, yet she smiled more genuinely than I'd seen her smile in the entire previous decade. I sat at the wooden dining table, staring at our simple, unremarkable meal, watching the pair beside me as a profound sense of peace settled heavy in my bones. This quiet satisfaction had evaded me for years, akin to a wandering ship finally dropping anchor in a safe harbor, the metal chain sinking firmly into sand as the vessel rocked gently to rest. "I have a job interview tomorrow," I told her, "with Mr. Bennett's design studio." Sarah lifted her head quickly, her eyes lighting up with genuine joy. "Truly?" "Yep, scheduled for the afternoon." "This is wonderful news," her grin widened. "You're finally returning to your craft." I chuckled quietly. "I haven't touched design work in 10 years. My skills are probably rusty." "Your talent won't fade," she replied firmly, no trace of empty comfort in her tone. "I saw the digital sketches you showed me on your phone a few weeks ago. Every single one was stunning. You pour that same dedication into everything you do, whether drafting layouts or caring for Dad." Her sincere praise left me flustered, and I ducked my head to focus on eating dumplings to hide my quiet embarrassment. William formed an enormous heart shape with his left hand, stretching his arm wide, as if wrapping the entire dining table within his silent gesture of affection. A full moon hung low outside the window, round and glowing pale silver. Warm lamplight blurred our 3 overlapping shadows against the living room wall, the outlines blending together until it became impossible to distinguish one figure from another. Ordinary days tasted much like those handmade dumplings, thin wrapper wrapping, rich, simple filling, unflashy yet deeply satisfying, every bite warm and nourishing down to the core. Perhaps that was the true essence of life. No grand, dramatic milestones, only endless mundane daily rituals, shared meals, quiet good mornings, whispered good nights, slow, steady companionship through every hardship. 10 years stretched far too long, erasing youthful vibrancy and replacing it with middle-aged weariness. Yet 10 years also slipped by fleetingly. When I glanced backward, every tear shed, every quiet laugh, every bitter argument, every fragile reconciliation flashed across my mind in a single instant. I set my design magazine aside and glanced toward William's bedroom, the door hanging ajar. Through the narrow gap, I spotted Lisa bending to wipe his hands, chattering away as she told him light-hearted jokes. William tilted his head to listen, a faint smile curving his wrinkled mouth, golden evening sunlight spilling across his lined cheeks to gild every deep crease. "Ethan, dinner's ready," Sarah's voice echoed from the kitchen. "I'm coming." I stood from the table and crossed to the kitchen, sliding into my seat at our worn wooden dining set. Sarah pushed a plate of fried poached eggs and warm congee toward me, sitting across the table beside me. Lisa wheeled William's chair over to join us. The four of us gathered around our modest table to begin a brand new day. Outside the window, the sun crested fully above the rooftops, flooding the entire city with brilliant golden light. I took a slow sip of steaming congee, its warmth spreading from my tongue down my throat, flooding every limb and nerve with gentle comfort. This quiet, ordinary life was perfect beyond measure. Months slipped by quickly, dozens of small, meaningful shifts unfolding within our household over the weeks following the courthouse incident. I attended my interview at Mr. Bennett's design studio, completing a live sample project on the spot that impressed him enough to offer an immediate full-time position. My salary exceeded what I'd earned before stepping away from design 10 years prior. While it couldn't match Sarah's former executive pay grade, the opportunity felt like an unexpected, precious gift I'd long thought lost forever. Sarah formally resigned her senior executive role, transferring internally to a flexible consulting position, requiring only 3 days of in-office attendance weekly, with the remaining 4 days spent working remotely from home. The arrangement balanced steady income with ample time to care for her father, and she'd refused my suggestion that she sacrifice her career entirely. "I used to believe professional success was everything worth chasing," she'd told me plainly, "but sitting beside Dad and talking with him for an hour brings more fulfillment than signing any million-dollar client contract ever could." Lisa continued her daily afternoon shifts, her bond with William growing stronger by the week. The pair had developed an entirely unique, silent sign language, unintelligible to anyone outside their small circle, communicating animatedly for hours each day. Once I returned home from work early to find Lisa gesturing wildly as she recounted her recent blind date stories, William laughing so hard his thin frame trembled, a level of unrestrained joy I hadn't witnessed in him since before his stroke. A non-verbal elderly man offering romantic advice to a young caregiver struck me as equal parts hilarious and profoundly moving. William's physical health also showed subtle, encouraging improvement, likely